Hi, I'm Margaret with Knit Pickers in beautiful Mayfield, Prince Edward Island. Welcome to part one of our three-part video series called the ABCs of Knitting. If you've always wanted to learn to knit, or you have knit before but it's been a long time and you just want to brush up on your skills, this video series is here to help. In this tutorial, we're going to be talking about how to do the basic knit stitch. We're also going to be learning how to cast on using the lace knit cast on and how to cast off. We did cover the lace cast on an earlier video, but we're going to go a little bit more in depth for the new knitters in this group. So let's get started. So this particular swatch that I have on the needle right now is the knit stitch. And when you knit the knit stitch over and over, row upon row, what you end up with is a stitch called the garter stitch, which is just knitting knit stitches on the right side and knitting knit stitches on the wrong side. The beauty of the garter stitch is that it lays perfectly flat. It's a wonderful stitch for knitting a basic little scarf. It's wonderful for collars, and it's also used an awful lot for borders around projects because it doesn't curl. A lot of stitches naturally curl, but this one, even before it's washed or steam set, lies perfectly flat. A real bonus. So let's get started on how you do a knit stitch. You take your two needles and with your yarn to the back of the needles, you go into the front of the stitch with your right hand needle and make a crisscross. The right hand needle will be behind your left hand needle. Take your yarn, wrap it around your needle, and I tend to hold it with my finger right here. And you just bring that right hand needle down in through the loop, back up, and slide it off your needle. And then give a little tug just to tighten the stitch up. So let's do that again. Your left hand needle has all of your knitting on it. Your right hand needle is the needle that you're transferring the stitches to. So with your right hand needle, you go into the first stitch on your left hand needle, go from the bottom up. The right hand needle will form a crisscross behind your left hand needle. Take your wool, wrap it around your needle, and as I said, I just tend to hold that wrapped wool with my finger so that it doesn't slide off my right hand needle. Bring the tip of your needle down, down, down underneath that stitch and slide that off your left hand needle, and your new stitch is on the right hand needle. So one more time again, into the bottom of the first stitch on your left hand needle, form that crisscross, wrap your yarn around your right hand needle, just resting your finger on that new wrap, slide your right hand needle down and underneath the stitch that's on your left hand needle and slide it off, just like that. So you can certainly get a lot faster as you're going on down. And there's different ways to hold your wool, and we can get into that in different videos. You can either put your needle in, wrap your yarn around, stitch it off. You can wrap the yarn through your fingers like this. Go in, wrap it like that, and bring it off. At this point, when you're learning, what's most important is just that you feel comfortable in how you're holding your knitting and how you're wrapping your yarn around. So that don't worry about technique too much at this point in time. Learn to feel comfortable and learn to have fun with your knitting. So we're just going in, wrap, down and back up and take it off your needle. In from the bottom, wrap it around, down underneath that stitch, up and off. Up, wrap, down and up and off, up, wrap, down and up and off. And that's pretty much it for the knit stitch. So I've finished my little sample swatch here, and just let's say that you've knit an entire scarf or you've knit a dishcloth. It's kind of important to know how to get this off your needles. So we're going to do the cast off, and cast off in this case is going to involve your knit stitch and one extra step. So what you do, you've got your knitting in your left hand, you've got your empty needle in your right hand, you go into that first stitch and knit your first stitch. And then go into the second stitch, knit that. Always remember with knitting, with the knit stitch, your yarn is to the back side of your project. Wrap the yarn around and knit that stitch. So far, that's exactly what we were doing when we were doing the basic knit stitch. But now, to cast off, we're going to take our left hand needle and grab the first stitch and lift it up and over stitch number 2. And we've cast off the first stitch. So let's do that again. Knit the next stitch just like we were doing before. So we knit it, pull it off the needle, but then from left to right we are going into stitch number 1 on the right hand needle and sliding it over and off your needle just like that. Okay, one more time, let's do that. From the bottom to the top, we're going to knit the stitch. We are going to, with the right hand needle, we're forming that crisscross. The right hand needle is underneath the left hand needle. We're wrapping the yarn around, and then we knit that stitch down and up. Now with our left hand needle, we're going into the first stitch from left to right. Can you see what I'm doing there? And then, ever so carefully, we're going in, sliding that new stitch, that first stitch over stitch number 2, and we've now cast off 3 stitches. So you just go in, wrap, knit, left to right on the first stitch, slide that up and over your second stitch, and keep on going right to the end of your row. Now we're nearing the end of our cast off row. So I'm going into the stitch on the left hand needle, knitting it just like a regular knit stitch, wrapping the yarn around the right hand needle, sliding it in and underneath and sliding it off, going into stitch number 1 and looping it over stitch number 2, and off the needle it goes. So now we're down to the final stitch. What we're going to do is go into and knit that last stitch, just like we've been doing. Go into the first needle, or the first stitch I should say, on your right hand needle. From left to right, wrap it over and drop it off, and we're down to 1 stitch left here. So all you need to do at that point is cut or break your yarn, slip it through that last stitch and pull it tight, and you now have a perfect cast off row. So we've now talked about how to do the basic knit stitch as well as casting off, but it doesn't do you much good unless you know how to cast on, so let's cover that. So the first step to doing a cast on is to do a slip knot. Some of you may have a technique to do a slip knot, others may not, so we're going to cover that right now. It's a really simple technique. What you want to do is you want to take your yarn and fold it over as if you were making one of those little cause ribbons that people see for Cancer Society or epilepsy. And what you're doing is you're just making a little loop. So the tail of your yarn is underneath the loop. The top yarn that's coming from the ball is over the top. So starting with your tail, around like this and over the top. Then what we're going to do is we're just going to take 2 fingers, we're going to slide it through that loop and hold on to the tail. We're going to grab the length of yarn from the ball and just pull it through. And there's your slip knot. It's called a slip knot because it's easy to adjust. So let's do that again. We take the yarn, lay it on the table, the short tail is underneath, put the long string of yarn from the ball over the top, making it look like one of the cause ribbons. Then hold on to the tail, and even if you want to hold it right where it crisscrosses here, okay, put your fingers through the loop, grab the yarn from the ball, and slide it through the loop. And there is your slip knot. And that slip knot forms your first stitch, and that goes onto your needle. So what we're going to do is a variation of the knit stitch. So with your right hand needle empty and your slip stitches on your left hand needle, we're going to go in just as if we were going to knit that stitch. So we go into that stitch from the bottom to the top, form that crisscross like we were doing for the knit stitch. Take your yarn, wrap it around your needle, and then bring your right hand needle down and knit that stitch. But the difference is, instead of pulling this stitch off your left hand needle and having everything on your right hand needle, we're just going to pull that up a little bit and slide this stitch straight back over onto the left hand needle and give it a little snug. So let's try that again. Go into the first stitch on your left hand needle as if you were going to knit it. Form that crisscross. Take your yarn, wrap it around your right hand needle, and like I said, I often hold that wrap with my right hand finger just to make sure that it's secure and doesn't pop off my needle. And I'm just going down underneath that stitch and back up again, and that's going to form my new stitch. Now normally if you were doing knitting, you would take this stitch off your left hand needle, but because we're casting on, we just stretch that out a bit, pop it straight back over, no twisting involved, back onto your left hand needle. So in, wrap, knit, but not the whole way. Don't take it off your needle. Give it a wee stretch, and you are transferring it straight over. No twisting, just straight over like that. Give it a little tug, and we've now cast on 4 stitches. So what you do is you cast on as many stitches as your project might require, and then you start knitting. So you can see here, I've just cast on 10 stitches using the knitted or lace cast on technique. Now there are a lot of different cast on techniques, and I will be making videos on all of them, and they all have their different properties and their different uses. Some are more stretchy than others, some are firmer, so it depends on the project that you're making. You might decide to use a firmer cast on for the hem of a sweater, but a stretchier cast on for the brim of a hat. And that's great, but right now all we're going to look at is the lace cast on because it's a very versatile cast on. It's got a fair amount of stretch. It's very easy to do. And unlike some cast-ons, you never need to worry about running out of yarn before you've cast on all the stitches that you need. So, what do you do after you've done your first cast-on row like that? Well, You just knit like we talked about earlier. So again, here we are. We're going into that first stitch on your left-hand needle. And keep in mind, you might find your cast-on row a little tighter than your knitted row, and you'll learn to adjust your cast-on row the more practice you have. So don't feel badly if you find it's a little bit snug as you're going in. So going into that first stitch, right needle from the bottom up with my right needle behind my left needle, wrap the stitch, the yarn is to the back of the knitting, down, up. So that's exactly what it looks like when we were casting on, but with knitting, remember you have to slide that stitch off. So again, up from the bottom of the stitch on your left-hand needle, wrap your knitting, down and underneath, up and off. Bottom up, wrap, down and under, and slide it off, up, wrap, down and under, up and off. And what you want to remember too is when you're knitting, you don't want to knit really close to the tips of your needles, because when you're using a certain size of needle, in this case I'm using a 5.5 millimeter needle, different patterns call for different needle sizes and different weights of yarn. It all depends on the type of fabric that you're looking to create. But the tip of your needle definitely is smaller than the main part of your needle. So if you are doing the majority of your knitting right down here at the tip, you're probably using perhaps a size 3.5 millimeter needle instead of a 5.5 millimeter needle. And that's going to create a big difference in the size of the stitch that you end up achieving. So while you are using the tips of your needles to slide it on and slide it off, you want to do your knitting close to the end of your knitting needle, but not right at the tip where it narrows down. So that's a wrap for the ABCs of Knitting Part 1. Take a little time to practice what we've covered this week, and next week join us and we'll be talking about the purl stitch. See you then, and happy knitting!